When you eat out in America, you always leave a tip. It's like a little bit of bonus money you give your server to thank them for good service. It encourages them to work harder and to earn more money for doing so, because after all, you get better tips for good service, right? Well, what if I told you this myth is completely false? Because today I'm going to challenge the idea of American tipping, and I'm going to argue that tips in America should actually be banned. Now, the idea of banning tips sounds absolutely outrageous to most people, but if you just give me a chance, I'm confident that by the end of this, you'll agree with me. Because tipping is bad for three main reasons. The first is that people often base their tip size off of arbitrary or irrational reasons, not actual service quality. The second is that tips often put servers in financially unstable environments. And the third is that tips are not necessary to the restaurant business at all. And if we got rid of tips, customers would still pay the same amount for food. So the first problem with tips is that they are not a true reflection of service quality. You know, the main reason most people really like their tips is because they think they get better tips for better service. But in reality, it rarely works this way. There's been several psychological studies, and they all find there's almost no relationship between service quality and tip size. There's one really good study conducted by Michael Lynn. He found that a good quality service only gets a 2% higher tip than bad quality service. So, you know, a really good waiter is only going to get a 2% higher tip than a really bad waiter. So really, there's almost no relationship between service quality and tips at all. So what does make the difference in tip amounts? Well, you know, there's been 5 different studies conducted, and they've all found that more attractive servers, on average, receive about 50% higher tips than those deemed unattractive or average looking. That goes for male and female servers. So apparently we have our restaurants mixed up with strip clubs. And psychologists also found that people leave higher tips if a server touches them on the arm or squats next to the table while they take their order, or if they just wear the color red. Those 3 things have been found to increase tip size a lot more than actual service quality, which are just like weird, random things. They're just, I don't know, it's something about our psychology makes us give higher tips to those random things, but it's almost never based on service quality. So really, tips aren't really doing their job if they're not a reflection of service quality. So I think that's one of the reasons we should get rid of tips. They're not really doing their job, and people don't get tips based on good quality service. That's hard to believe, but that's why we've had so many studies over it, because it's hard to believe, and they all come back with the same conclusion. So that's one reason we should get rid of tips. So another reason is that I often leave servers in financially unstable environments. You know, we often think of tips as just some bonus money, but in reality they're not. Tips account for a huge portion of a person's income. Because in Kentucky, the minimum wage is $7.25. But if you work for tips, businesses are actually allowed to pay you less than minimum wage. If you earn $30 of tips a month, servers can pay you as low as $2.13 an hour in Kentucky. That's hard to believe, but that is true if you look that up. It's called the tip minimum wage. And what that does, it makes servers just completely financially reliant on tips to make a living. And when them tips are based off of the irrational, arbitrary reasons I mentioned earlier, it can be a very scary and financially unstable environment to work in. You know, if the tips are dry for just like a week or two, you're not making any money at all. And another problem with, you know, it puts an unnecessary amount of stress on the customer. Because as a customer, I can't ever really find what a good tip to leave is. Everybody says you should leave a different amount, and tips, it's just really too vague to account for such a large portion of a person's income. I'm always afraid I'll leave too much or too little. If you're with a group, everybody's arguing over how much to leave. It just puts an unnecessary amount of stress on the customer and on the server. So due to the financial environment it leaves the servers in, I think that's another reason we should get rid of tips. So the third reason tips are bad is because they're not really necessary to the restaurant business at all. Tips are just an American-only thing, and every other country around the world doesn't really have tips, and they do fine. So if we got rid of tips, the only difference is that restaurants, they just higher the prices on food They'd pay their servers a normal amount, and the customer would just pay their check, go home, don't worry about tips. And a lot of people, that makes a lot of sense, really, when you think about it, because that's how every other business in America is run. When you go to the grocery store, you buy a carton of eggs for $4.25. You don't pay like $3.50 and however much you think the cashier deserves. And the restaurant, they just work the same way. You'd pay the business, and the business would pay the employees. And a lot of people, they hear that, and they don't like that idea, because they're thinking, well, if servers didn't have tips to chase after, they wouldn't work as hard. They just halfway do their job. But really, that's not true, because every other country in the world doesn't have tips, and food still gets to the table on time. A great example of this is Japan. Japan has no tipping culture at all. If you leave a tip on the table in Japan, they'll actually see it as an insult, like you're giving them charity. So they have no tipping culture, yet they have more Michelin stars than any other country in the world. Best restaurants in the world. So Asian countries don't really have any tipping culture. European countries don't really have any tipping culture. It's just an American-only custom. And it's a custom we'd be better off without, because it's just kind of a way we fall behind the rest of the world. Because if we got rid of tips, the only difference would be that servers would have a stable income and customers wouldn't have to worry about what kind of tip to leave. So those are the 3 reasons tipping should be banned. The first, tips are not an actual reflection of service quality. The second is that it puts servers in financially unstable environments. And the third is they are not necessary to the restaurant business. And I know a world without mandatory tipping is hard to imagine. But just because it's a system we work in does not mean it's a good system. And if we got rid of it, I think we'd be a lot better off. So if you want to help out with this issue, one thing you can all do, you can call your local Kentucky State Senator and just ask them about raising the tipped minimum wage. Several other states in America has gotten rid of the tipped minimum wage. Kentucky's not one of them. Businesses are allowed to pay servers as low as $2.13 an hour, and that's the biggest problem with tips. So I think if we all did that, it'd make a big difference.